Well, hey folks, it's your old pal King Waspinator. Welcome back to Total Party Skills. Be sure to hit like and subscribe. I'm going to talk a bit about philosophical underpinnings of the world of darkness. I'm going to make several videos out of it. I'm going to start this one off with Vampire the Masquerade. Obviously, on the surface, Vampire is a game about politics. Yeah, I mean, clearly, you do a lot of politics in the game. A lot of it's focused on, the interplay between the various factions and clans and political maneuvering up and down the hierarchy of any given city's structure. I feel like it goes a bit beyond that, though. There's some things kind of running under the surface because of the fact that these characters, both NPCs and the player characters in a typical Vampire the Masquerade game, are vampires. And what that's kind of like making a statement about the people who are within power structures within society. I mean, right off the bat, vampires, once human but now elevated above, immortal, gifted with supernatural ability, but also secret weaknesses that can be exploited. I feel like that's a fairly obvious analogy towards, just being a member of any elite class, regardless of how you want to structure your society. The fact that most vampire city courts are structured along classic feudal structures is very appropriate. I am in agreement with Frank Herbert in that feudalism is the default setting for human society, not even like medieval feudalism. I mean, just the entire power structure is fairly endemic across the human race. I mean, there are obviously always going to be exceptions because of, like long periods of time of humans being isolated into fairly small regions and yada, yada, yada. But we do seem to continually fall back upon a feudal pattern of structure. And even in its absence, as much as we've done in the last few centuries to break away from feudalism, there's echoes of that power structure still remaining within modern power structures. And so the fact that in Vampire you have the prince and the primogen, there's a central council often, each representing the major power blocks within the given domain. But always the crown has to fall on one person's shoulders at some point or another for both the responsibility and the duty to wield the final decision-making processes. But also, they're monsters. They're monsters that have to maintain a facade. The whole point of the Masquerade is that the vampires that rule us must pretend to be one of us in order to be able to survive, because despite their great powers and abilities, they do have their vulnerabilities and the common cattle at the bottom of the system that they have to feed upon every night. Their entire existence is buoyed by destroying the lives of average people that they just see as, mere animals and livestock to be used up. One or two of us might seem handy to them, so we get elevated to kind of like a mid-tier state of privilege, often to serve as guardians or entertainers, or as useful go-betweens. The sorts of people who get privileged positions, but themselves are still not actually really members of the elite. The greater super factions that extend just beyond each individual city, the Camarilla, the Sabbat, the Anarchs, those, basically are good stand-ins just for the concept of political party philosophies, which can transcend and sweep across multiple different varying, otherwise independent nations. And the Camarilla are the establishment, based upon tradition, the most careful about wanting to maintain the Masquerade because they have the clearest memory of the last time that the Masquerade fell and a bunch of them were wiped out by an uprising of the cattle. The Sabbat are, the evil antithesis of the Camarilla. Theirs is a subversion and rebellion and defiance of the social mores of what the Camarilla promotes. They reject the path of humanity. They believe that they should be able to revel openly above the human race without having to hide in the shadows and all that. The thing with the Sabbat is because of the way that they are like structured as an antithesis to the Camarilla, which means that they can't really ever truly function on their own in a vacuum. They can never really get rid of the Camarilla. Without the Camarilla, they don't exist. Their existence isn't justified, and there is no power structure in existence already for them to frame themselves against as an alternative. And then you have the Anarchs, which are just basically the we want to be left alone types, which, you know, are fine, are arguably like actually the most peaceful, the least trying to interfere with everything around them, but also because of the fact that they're trying to reject all power structures, they continuously find themselves vulnerable. And so, you know, the Anarchs are in a kind of a continuous cycle of renewal and destruction. Entangled through all of that is obviously, I feel like there's a lot of allegories to be taken and compared and contrasted to the real world. The world of darkness in general, as far as role-playing game settings go, is in some ways its own weird, fucked up way, possibly one of the more accurate depictions of real life. You strip out all the supernatural stuff out of it, remove the vampires and the werewolves, you still are left with one of the few depictions in pop culture of the ugly humanity. It's not a heroic world where people are, you know, endowed to be better than what they were, you know, set up with to start with, where people are excelling towards a better future and are learning to be kind to their brother and all that other kind of that good pat ourselves in the back nonsense that we see in most of our fictional depictions of life, where we try to sanitize things and make it all Disney and family friendly, you know. The World of Darkness, because it's framing itself as a game where you're supposed to be playing monsters and vampires and werewolves and all that kind of shit, you know, it excuses, you know, being able to depict that ugly, guttural, vile, disgusting, violent, sexual side of the human race that you don't often get to see in a whole lot of, you know, like I said, pop culture, fictional depictions of life. And, you know, so throughout it, it's various different lines, like what I'm discussing in Vampire. There are kind of like some philosophical lessons, I feel, that can be pulled out of them and kind of to use to kind of like depict things about life that don't normally get to be depicted in games like D&D, which are basically just colorful, silly war games for children. White Wolf is trying to impart something more mature upon its audience. How well it does that in the end is dependent upon the people running the games to actually manifest the damn things and all that good stuff. But return to the 3rd century BC and the very dawn of civilization in Pax Luporum, Werewolves of the Republic, complete with campaign setting sourcebooks for the island of Sicily and the island of Lesbos. Now available as a collected starter kit edition. Available now on Amazon.com and DriveThruRPG. Now, part of the point of this series I'm doing here about the philosophy of the World of Darkness games is not to be attempting to portray any sort of authorial intent. I'm going for what I pull out of the material, less so much what people like Mark Reinhagen or Bill Bridges, had intended. Author intent certainly has its factor to play in things, but once the piece has been released to the public, how the public interacts with it is somewhat out of the author's control. I feel like a good modern day example is the whole phenomenon of how terms like the red pill and other aspects of the Matrix movies have been adopted by popular culture that kind of run, against the intentions of how the authors of those films wanted those terms to be framed. However, in regards to my thoughts on Werewolf the Apocalypse, it's not entirely outside of the realm that some of the stuff that I'm going to say might have been in the mind of Bill Bridges and some of the other writers who worked on the project over the years. There are certainly aspects of the setting that hint at kind of my own interpretation of it, However, at no point do I ever remember it really being clearly spelled out in these terms. Now, Werewolf the Apocalypse, I played it a lot back in the day, back in the 90s, so, I myself, interacted with other people who are into werewolf and such, and it was a much more eclectic of a crowd than I believe stereotype would present. There certainly were some kind of oddball fellows who were attracted to it, and there is kind of an aspect to the White Wolf games that in some ways they themselves attract the kinds of personality archetypes to play the games as you would find amongst the creatures that are in the games. And so to a certain degree, I kind of feel like some of the point of Werewolf was a little bit missed by a lot of its own player base. Even myself at the time, I would say. I mean, a lot of this is, me like looking back on these materials from an older, wiser perspective and all that kind of stuff. Werewolf is a game about rage. Now, what is rage? What makes rage different from emotions like anger or hate? Rage is a primordial reactionary kind of feeling, one driven from deep despair and threat of some sort of imminent catastrophe. These are the sorts of circumstances that will typically bring rage out of a person. Rage is a last defense, a last burst of furious energy to try to get yourself out of whatever terrible, terrible situation you might find yourself in. Even if in some cases with humans, because of our complex thinking, we will sometimes manufacture the illusion of being in one of those situations, therefore triggering a rage reaction, when in reality there actually isn't really the real environmental pressures that would necessitate such a reaction. But werewolves are all about rage. It's a core, component of what makes a werewolf a Geru in Werewolf the Apocalypse. And what does that kind of really say about what's going on with them? I think, in many ways, the werewolves are actually the root problem in the World of Darkness, going by their own internal mythology of themselves. There is a bit of a problem with all the World of Darkness games, in that towards the end of the run, Exalted came out and created like this mythic universalized past that hints that it's from where all the various World of Darkness grew, back in a almost Middle Earth kind of setting where, like, before the world was round and fully complete, there was this kind of like timeless, every world, all peoples kind of zone that was like laid out by like the four elements, and you can kind of travel infinitely off to the horizon where just eventually it's just nothing but sea or nothing but forest or nothing but fire and so on and so forth. However, in Werewolf, a lot of the changing breeds and the werewolves themselves have deep memories that go like way predate modern human history, which is not necessarily entirely legendary, considering the fact that werewolves do have the thing where, like, unlike a lot of people in the world whose spiritual beliefs are at some point a bit of a leap of faith, werewolves are able to physically enter the spirit world and interact with these things, including their ancestor spirits. And so their ability to have knowledge transmitted to modern generations from the past is much more theoretically reliable than, what, say, humans are able to do with writing and, oral histories and all that kind of stuff. The werewolves are arrogant. They have self-appointed themselves to be the guardians of Gaia. They self-appointed themselves to be, the colors of the early human population with their impergium. I feel like there's probably a pretty good, strong contention to be made that had the Geru not terrorized early primitive humanity so much, humanity would not have turned so hard against nature, therefore leading up to the modern day situation where the Gaian spirit that the werewolves revere so much seems under imminent threat. Also, the reactionary nature of rage and how that's caused the werewolves to operate has led to things like the War of Rage, where they attacked and tried to wipe out the other shapeshifters because they didn't think they were doing enough to do their duty to help protect Gaia and all that kind of stuff, even including to, at points, taking out some of their own fellow werewolf tribes, largely because of paranoia and reacting to things, not really thinking things through. The werewolves assume that Gaia condones their actions, they also assume that the worm is the problem. The spiritual world of Werewolf, and also of the greater, White Wolf World of Darkness setting, does not present like a monotheistic view of a spiritual hierarchy. The spirit of Gaia is a relatively minor god. Not a tiny little spirit, but it's like maybe a second or third tier entity. But the top tier entities is the triad. So instead of a monotheistic omni-being or a dualistic omni-being, instead of having a yin-yang balance between forces in the universe, what White Wolf has is a trinity of forces that balance each other. You have the wild, which is the raw force of creation, raw, limitless, untapped potential. Now you have the weaver, which takes the materials created by the wild and then gives them form and structure. And then the worm is what destroys these things when their time comes and creates the whole, circle of life, Simba. Part of the crux of the problem, as found in the modern world, in terms of what sort of spiritual malaise envelops all of creation in the setting, is that the Trinity is broken. The werewolves think it's the worm that's the problem, but in reality it's the weaver. The weaver has corrupted the worm and driven it insane, and is using the worm as a recycling device so that it could refresh materials that it can go ahead and then restructure and reorder in its ongoing quest to, try to, create a perfectly balanced, perfected universe. And the wild is the part that's being cut off. The wild does not threaten the worm. The wild threatens the weaver, because every time the weaver gets everything set up the way it wants, the wild introduces new, raw, formless chaos, and the weaver doesn't like that. And so weaver, by enslaving the worm, is, as I said, trying to cut out the wild and starve it out of the system. That is the real breakdown of the spiritual triangle and why things are off balance and inverted. But because the werewolves are reactionary creatures, all they see is the worm and manifestations of the worm and worm's servants, worm's fomori, banes, all that kind of stuff. They're the ones that are doing the direct damage that they can visibly see. And so they're throwing themselves against the worm and its forces kind of single-mindedly, and kind of are blind to the fact that really they're responsible for the apocalypse. I don't think they should win at all. I think that in the end, the werewolves should be hamstrung by the fact that their previous mistakes have put them in this situation. In particular, the chastisement of the other changing breeds, so that even their survivors, they're not likely to want to show up and have the Garus back there at whatever final fight against the forces of the worm there is. And that might be the critical flaw. They were not intended. There's a reason why we have all these different kinds of shapeshifters. It wasn't just all supposed to be werewolves. But their inability to see that this is their fault, because they're just angry and just constantly pushing against these things that are only pushing back against them because of their earlier actions. And so insofar that there's lessons there to be found, I feel like obviously just basic human behavior is kind of a lesson to be learned from that whole kind of framing of what the werewolves are. We must be cautious about reacting with blind rage, and learn to understand that the situation we find ourselves in globally in a lot of different ways is all based on a very long and ancient chain of events that, we're kind of blind to our responsibility points to. We might acknowledge a few things were errors, but even then we have kind of we'll just get over it, guys, kind of attitude. And that leads us so that, if there's some sort of end times confrontation, the Garu are going to be left standing on their own because they've alienated everyone who otherwise might have been there to help them at the end. And so, hopefully we ourselves could learn the maturity to discover our own version of that in the real world, and try to address it in a way that actually leaves us whole again. No longer angry at ourselves. To what degree is the rage the creation of their own actions and not a reaction? Werewolves want to think of themselves as Gaia's immune system, but in a way they're are they more Gaia's cancer? Are they the cellular agitation that's gone out of control and has been destabilizing the system? They're the thing that destabilized the system because no one appointed them king. No one told them to attack and harass humanity so much that even the sheer sight of the creatures drives us nuts and makes us forever afraid and fearful and feeling detached from the natural world from which we emerged in. Within the fictional universe of the World of Darkness, werewolves have had a tremendous impact on the massive apathetic humanity that, in the modern day part of the setting, other factions such as, mages and changelings and such, might mock and lament the apathy of the masses. But the werewolves are arguably the thing that put humanity on that path where they just want to blind themselves to the harsher truths of reality and live their cozy little hedonistic, power-mongering lives, ignorant of the dark forces that pull our strings, because it's easier.
Enter a world of magic and the paranormal with Ghosts of the Shadow Zone. 2 complete tabletop games in one, featuring source material such as The Young and the Restless Dead, and Secrets of the Lesbian Illuminati, as seen in the classic horror tabletop collection. Available now at Amazon.com and DriveThruRPG.
So I guess it's time we talk about Mage the Ascension, which is a bit of a daunting task. It's a game about reality, and that's a rather huge and controversial subject. It helps to try to simplify things as much as possible just to be able to try to convey things in speech in a YouTube video. But basically, at its core, Mage is about how the juxtaposition between knowledge and intention forms the perceptual grid that we use to navigate reality. Mage takes some of that into kind of literal terms of it being a game setting where the mage is able to intentionally enforce their will to shape reality as they want it, even though it does cause a risk of paradox. Whereas in the real world, there is a similar phenomenon going on. We do exist in kind of a perceived reality. We are limited to how our brains interpret what our senses are telling us about what is going on around us in the environment. Some people can take that literally. It's where a lot of modern simulation theory kind of stems from, and also ancient simulation theory. I mean, Plato was just as much into this as the Wachowskis, kind of a thing, which leads some people into dangerous and kind of nearly sociopathic kind of ways of thinking. That is the path where you start to think that you're the fundamental generator of reality around you, and in Mage that kind of is reinforced in terms of the metaphysics that drive the magic that drives the core conflicts of the game. Mage is very much presented as a war for reality, primarily between the older traditional groupings of magic and the modern technocracy, with these small little appendix factions known as the Marauders, who are pure chaos, and the Nefandi, who are kind of inverting the whole thing. Instead of searching for ascension, they're searching for descension and have allied themselves with infernal powers and all that kind of stuff. They're basically your satanic mages. Except it's, of course, not necessarily tied to any one particular faith belief system. Vampire, the Masquerade, and even Kindred of the East in its own different variation, they're both kind of tied to real specific kind of world belief structures. The vampires believe themselves to be descendants of Cain, the Cain that murdered Abel, and who was marked by God to be cursed and became the first vampire, and all that kind of stuff. Mage kind of attempts to float above that in kind of a more generalized metaphysic. The traditions are a grouping of otherwise, unaligned types and flavors and practices of magic who, as they've been losing to the technocracy and to basically reason, they've been forced to become unlikely bedfellows for their mutual protection. The technocracy is winning because that great soup of humanity prefers what the technocracy is selling, as the technocracy, by explaining out the processes that manifest their magic, it allows a large chunk of the things they produce to eventually be able to be adopted by the dumber, unenlightened, sleeping mass. Whereas with many, but not all of the other traditions and the Marauders and the Nefandi, it's much more about the arrogant, I am in control, I am the center of things, like what I intend to happen is what's going to happen, be damned the consequences, and be damned what the rest of the world thinks. Much like Werewolf, there is an underlying arrogance to Mage and Mage characters, but, it kind of goes hand in hand with, being the type of person who, if imbued with that sort of ability, would use it in such ways. You kind of have to be arrogant to try to override reality in one way or the other. Despite the fact that the technocracy bases, their manifestations of the spheres in terms of like high-end, cutting-edge, envelope-pushing science, it's still all based from ideas, which is very much kind of directly analogous to how science itself works. So like I was saying, in the real world, we do live in a perceptual grid. Part of that perceptual grid is based upon knowledge, and the other part is based upon what we want, our desires. Between these two things, they will shape how we experience everything that's there. The thing that's different between the real world and the fictional world of Mage is that there is actually a real world. Our problem is because of the limitations of our senses, our ability to truly and accurately describe what it is we are seeing, touching, feeling, tasting, and so on is all a little bit of a question mark. Because are we really hearing a thing when it's really just air concussion vibrations fluttering against tiny little bones in our ears? Is the table I'm touching right now like really what I'm feeling with my fingertips? Nothing is actually what it looks like in color, because all the colors we see are light being reflected back. So the actual color that the thing holds to itself is the colors of the thing that we can't see. All we see is the spectrum that's radiated back out away from it. So what we're really seeing are reflections of everything. So like in our own way, we kind of live in an own kind of strange negative image kind of mirror universe of what we actually are seeing around us. What we know of what we're seeing informs so much about how we perceive it. An analogy I've used many times in the past, and you've probably heard variants before, is once upon a time there was a place called ancient Greece. And the people there, believed in the gods of Olympus, who were ruled over by Zeus, who commanded the skies and the clouds and the lightning. And they believed in Poseidon, who could shake the seas and cause earthquakes and send great tidal waves to wipe out whole cities, and so on and so forth. Now, modern-day people, with our massive array of technological sensors and flight-capable devices and underwater devices and all that kind of stuff, the whole host of ways we've learned to extend our senses through technology to try to get a more accurate read of exactly what the hell is going on around us. We can go to the top of Mount Olympus, the actual real Mount Olympus, and see that there is no city of the gods. We know what causes thunder and lightning. We know what causes earthquakes and tidal waves, or at least we highly suspect what's going on, and insofar as that suspicion allows us to make accurate predictions, you can derive that there is some sort of fundamental truth to that. Now, the thing is in Mage, the thing that holds reality together is the mass sleeping humanity and what they have all agreed upon to be common reality. And the reason why the technocracy has ultimately won the war for reality is because the sleeping masses have now come to rely upon the neutralized, rationalized philosophy that the technocracy approaches. Now, the conventions of the technocracy are not the only technocratic traditions. You could alternatively divide the various factions of Mage up into two groups, and that is the mystics and the scientists. Several of the traditions are actually scientists. Obviously, the Virtual Adepts being a renegade convention and the Sons of Ether being a rejected convention both qualify as being in the scientific category. But I would also include the Order of Hermes as well. They representing like the most primitive, earliest form of magical science in terms of how they approach magic through, numerology and various kinds of mystic formulae, whereas they're not more a kind of raw type of mystic as you would find amongst Dream Speakers or Verbena or the Cult of Ecstasy or even the Euthanatos and Akashic Brotherhood. The Marauders and the Nefandi probably also fall into the mystic category. I might contend or accept that the Nefandi are the lone representative of the third force of the great triple wheel of reality. Mage, takes place in the same cosmological universe as Werewolf. Mages generally, with the exception of like Verbena and Dream Speakers, they generally don't quite personify and anthropomorphize the fundamental forces of reality. They don't think of the worm and the weaver and the wild as being sentient cosmic beings. They instead, think of things as being, instead of the weaver, you have pattern, and instead of the worm, you have just entropy itself, and so on. So they come at it from a more kind of neutralized position in order for all the various kind of traditions to kind of be able to get along with each other to some degree, kind of creating almost like there is that element of there is a universal truth that's going on there. Is just each of these different factions of mages have their own approach to how they want to see it, if you catch my distinction. Now, people in ancient Greece believed in Zeus. Now, we know that Zeus isn't real, and yet, back then they believed very strongly in Zeus, and their beliefs about what Zeus wanted and expected of them, or what would Zeus might do or curse them with, would have a dramatic effect on how they lived their lives. And then you have the whole unfolding chaotic butterfly effect, that ripples out from ancient Greece across the world and across history, even up to today, because of people making little minor decisions, day-to-day decisions, all based on the fact that they believe Zeus and Poseidon and Apollo are all sitting over their shoulder watching them. You can extrapolate that all around the world and across time, and the various beliefs that have shaped people's decision-making processes and therefore have shaped their reality. The thing is, it's not like they back then were believing these things in defiance. They weren't even really believing in these things as we use the word believe in the modern sense. Back then, they knew Zeus was there. Knowledge, what you consider to be your body of knowledge, is a fundamental aspect of what colors what you think is seeing. Your knowledge of a tree out the window shapes what you think is going on out there when you see a tree out the window. But people who come from a different body of knowledge are going to have a radically different experience. And aside from the fact that we are both observing that something's going on over there, our ability to actually really determine which version of that thing is the real one or not might be the question. We have the problem in the development of AI, of how do you teach an artificial intelligence to be able to recognize a chair. A chair is not just one shape of chair. A chair can be all sorts of things. And there's things that are distinctly not chairs that can be repurposed as chairs and so therefore can still be called a chair given contexts. How do you teach that to an unborn intelligence that does not come with any of the pre-built-in sensory programming that we in part run upon as we move about our lives? The parts of us that are entirely instinctive and that we don't even really see or notice because they are part of an ever-present background of our experience and therefore can't really be seen in a way. What is ascension, for that matter? Is it merely just enlightenment? Or is ascension the ability to be able to determine what the tree really is? That's why I kind of feel that in many ways in the game Mage the Ascension, by the fact that they ended things off with the attainment of a 10th sphere, I kind of feel runs in reverse of what really should have been done. They should have been dropping it down to the 9 spheres become 1 sphere, or even better yet, 0 spheres. Pure actual exposure to the fundamental underlying truth of things. Implicit to the ability to gain the new awareness is the shedding of the old awareness. Ascension implies that your whole being is like realigned. It's the end of Highlander when he starts floating up in the air and all these ghosts start roaring up in and out of him. It's as much an end of self as death. Like, is ascension something that's even really worth searching for? If in the end it's also just as much a quest for oblivion, it's just you're cool with it on the way out. Part of the problem of changing people, and which is somewhat expressed in the game, Mage the Ascension, is when people are convinced of a thing, you can tell them all about it, but if they don't accept it on their own, change has to come within, kind of a thing. What's causing the paradox is that the people around the mage don't agree with what they're doing. And so, in a way, the sleepers possibly already are kind of like, as a mass entity, enlightened in their own way. Anti-magic is, after all, the strongest type of magic, is it not?
Stay waspinated.